Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio, and I'm going to go ahead and toss this over onto the Game Changer radio podcast over there on Sports Talk 790 because we're going to talk about eSports in this podcast tonight. The song you're listening to it's called the Super Smash Brothers 64 medley. It's by a guitarist named Cole Rowland, and of course, I will leave a link to it in the podcast description, so make sure you go check him out. This song is actually from a few years ago. He recorded a few years ago, and back when I started putting more music on the podcast, this was actually the song I had in mind, but for some reason I forgot that his name was Cole Rowland, and I thought he didn't make music anymore. I couldn't find him anywhere on YouTube, but that's just because I forgot his name. His name is Cole Rowland, and the transition, we'll pick up the song at the end of the podcast, but that transition into the Hyrule theme is just brutal. It is so awesome. Oh, I freaking love it. But we'll continue with that song at the end of the podcast. I'm, of course, your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and eSports. It's no surprise to anybody right now. Well, maybe some people, depending on who you are, that eSports is becoming more and more of a juggernaut as far as the entertainment industry is concerned, in sports in general. NBA, hockey, baseball, football, eSports is a huge up-and-comer on that stage. And I've talked about eSports many, many times here in Geek Therapy Radio. And if you're listening to the Game Changer Radio podcast, of course, that's the very nature of what we do here at Game Changer Radio. Video games and eSports. But what I want to talk about tonight, or today, this morning, this afternoon, whenever you're listening to the podcast, are the aspects and the new studies going into the stressors that eSports athletes endure and how they're actually quite similar, if not the same, as other athletes. Now, I'm saying stressors. The guy playing CSGO, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, is not taking the pounding to the dome that a professional linebacker is. They're not taking all the impacts. They're not even taking the impacts that a quarterback occasionally receives, or they're not taking the impacts that I'm sorry, someone's outside my door. That even a basketball player endures, or a soccer player. That kind of stamina and stress, that kind of physical exertion, not in the same way, but they are enduring a lot of the same stressors. So much so, in fact, that some teams and leagues have invested in psychological research into for their players, for the top elite players, to start identifying and addressing the top stresses and how to deal with those stresses and how to train athletes and how to pick athletes that are able to better endure those stressors to give the results that the team requires. So to put it like this, you don't go to the NFL Combine or whatever and pick the guy with the most heart. You pick the guy who gets the most consistent results, because at the end of the day, if you're talking about the NFL in this example, you're trying to win championships. And you're going to sign players that you think give you the best odds of winning championships. You're not just picking the person who wants to play the game more than the other person. If that were the case, then really, really crappy players would be in the NFL. Not that there aren't already some crappy players, but you get what I'm saying. Just because you have the most heart doesn't mean you have the most ability. So in examining these stressors and examining the psychology behind what goes into esports and how it is similar to other athletes. So as esports continues to build, in 2018 alone, hundreds of millions of people tuned in to esports broadcasts and esports in general, even though even currently in 2019 going into 2020, esports is a general term it's an all-encompassing term for all the different games that players play and all the different leagues. So, you've got, Dota and Rocket League, and CSGO is the game that'll never die, basically. Fortnite. All of these different games, and they're played by all of these different leagues and all of these different tournaments, but esports kind of just encompasses all that. So esports in general is, as of now, 2019 going into 2020, it's $1 billion industry. As of 2015, a players' union was established to delegate and relegate trade. So trading athletes from team to team, just like you would in the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball. And you're talking about people who are playing video games, basically, on that kind of competitive level. Tournaments, officially sanctioned tournaments, the prize pools in these things can be anywhere from $75,000 to well over $1 million. This is not chump change anymore. This is not just people messing around playing video games. There's actual real money and real stake here. So when you have promoters putting together teams and leagues putting together teams and owners putting together teams, they want to know everything about a potential player, about a prospect. So there have been studies more and more going into the psychological effects of esports, how individual players deal with these individual stressors to say, okay, this person's going to be a good fit in our team because we have the psychological, basically, dossier and physical dossier on this player, and we know that they will be a good fit for the chemistry of our team towards the goal of winning the prize pool, which it will only become bigger and bigger and bigger. Players getting multinational endorsements from different PC manufacturers and peripherals and even in apparel and what have you. Just like Tiger Woods would be sponsored by Nike, you have esports players sponsored by Corsair and Dell and Microsoft and what have you. There's big money here. So we're not just the prize pool that I mentioned, anywhere from $75,000 to millions of dollars. That's not even counting the endorsement deals. These players are thoroughbred racehorses at this point. There's a lot of money and stake going into it. So I want to talk about these psychological studies a little bit. So to boil it down simply, I don't know, even if you're not a huge gamer, you've experienced this from time to time in your life, even playing a board game or a card game, whatever. But in particular to gaming, the term rage quit. We've all experienced that urge to rage quit. And if you've played any sort of online gaming, one of the most frustrating things in the world isn't that you have a sucky teammate or something like that, an inexperienced teammate. It's having people on either side just rage quitting, which means in ranked tournaments, you usually aren't allowed just to quit the match. You have to physically unplug your computer or physically hard reset your computer to get out of a match. It's bad news bears. You're usually penalized pretty heavily for it. But more than that, you're inflicting, you're pissing off other people just trying to enjoy the game, basically, by rage quitting. But you can understand, but we can all understand that desire. The match is going so poorly for me, or I'm so pissed off at my teammates, or whatever. You just want to yank the Ethernet cable or disconnect the Wi-Fi. God forbid you're gaming in earnest and ranked matches on Wi-Fi, but you get what I'm saying. What's the difference between a gamer who is more prone to rage quitting versus somebody who sticks it out? And let me give you a real world example of this, because my esport of choice, if I was to compete in any tournament currently right now, with any game being played in earnest right now on the world stage, it's still Rocket League. My game right now is still Rocket League. A second game down the list right now, just in terms of skill, would probably be Street Fighter. I haven't really played Street Fighter 5, but Ultra Street Fighter 4, Street Fighter 4 in general, sure, I'll go into some tournaments. I would be happy to play and have some fun in there and hold my own a little bit. But when I play Rocket League, what is the difference between someone like me, I'm not that great or anything like that, but the last thing in the world I would ever dream of doing, just out of pure shame, just out of being ashamed of myself, the last thing I would ever do is rage quit. Even if my team is down by 15 goals, which is quite a bit in Rocket League. You have to be taken hard in Rocket League to be down by 15 goals. But let's just say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how badly I'm doing. Doesn't matter how badly my teammates are doing. I'm not going to rage quit. Because my mentality, at the point at which it comes to you can either rage quit or continue, I'm going to keep playing. I'm going to continue, because the way I treat being down by 10 goals or whatever, if we're talking about Rocket League specifically, is this is just free time to experiment and practice. Think about what it is I did in the match to contribute to being down by 10 goals and change it, break a bad habit. You don't do that if you just rage quit. You're not going to learn anything. You're always going to be a quitter. You're always going to be a loser in terms of wins to losses in video games if you're prone to rage quitting. Always. You're never going to be as good as you can be if you're prone to rage quitting. So some of these psychological studies in eSports athletes will, of course, identify how does somebody handle that stress of losing? Because very often, and again, in my experience, the best part of esports, the best part of playing games, especially online, is coming from behind to get the win. If you rage quit, you will never experience that. But some people are very short-sighted. So what is the psychology behind being a giant baby and just ripping the power cord out of your computer and sticking with it and focusing and what do you call it? Try-harding. I would rather somebody on my team be a try-hard and a ball chaser than a rage quitter. Full stop, period. But it would help if you're spending thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars on putting together a team for an esport. You want the person who doesn't rage quit. You want the person who perseveres. You want that personality type. And that's what these psychological studies will help us to unravel, help us to see and to notice in players and make, educated judgments on who is the best player for my team based on how they handle the stress and how they cope with the stress that is part of playing esports, competitive esports, especially for real money. So these studies are not only physical, but psychological. They're figuring out what stressors are being put on these athletes that are unique to esports that one might not necessarily face, in the NBA, but there are similarities in how you cope to stresses. So a player getting ready for a big game is going to feel the same amount of stress as an esports player getting ready for a big match, especially a tournament, especially semifinals and finals. It's the same thing. So you can adapt some things with the other things, one sport with the other sport, in terms of how to help players, highly paid players, deal with those stresses. And when it comes to physical, you're measuring things like heart rate, oxygen levels, breathing patterns, all sorts of physical stressors. And you're measuring diet and nutrition as well, and rest. And other things such as communications. How well does this player communicate? How well does this player understand instructions? How well can a coach coach? How well can a coach communicate? Things all the way down to conflicting schedules. And the type of stress that maybe a professional athlete in the NBA wouldn't experience, as opposed to an athlete in an up-and-coming league, up-and-coming sport like eSports. These are all things to consider, and as eSports makes more and more money and gets more and more worldwide attention, these are important factors to figure out and help nail down. So to take one concept and kind of boil it down to what we're after here, one of the things we're after here, one of the things that we've identified, I've done any personal research into it. I mean, I have a little bit, but I am not an actual professor or scientist studying this. But here's one concept that is universal for any athlete, and it applies to esports athletes as well. And I'm going to take this little element, these few lines out of this research article, and I will include the link to this research down in the podcast description as well. But here's an excerpt. An ability to deal with the demands of elite performance environments has been identified as a key element needed for sporting excellence. Unquote. Well, yeah. If you can't handle the pressures of elite performance environments, if you can't handle the pressure of the crowd, if you can't handle the pressure on yourself, let's just face the facts here. The pressure on yourself, the pressure of not wanting to let not only your teammates down, but your fans down, your friends and family down, whatever, all of those pressures. As it dawns on me, it's an interesting thought. There's an interesting concept that just, honestly, as I'm recording this podcast right now, just kind of dawned on me. And we're all geeks about something. This is just kind of a geek thing that popped in my brain to think about. And that is the I generation, not so much millennials, but the I gen, the generation that has grown up increasingly isolated from one another. And what I mean is, I don't mean online communities, because that's kind of one of the interesting factors that is at play here, is that, for instance, teen pregnancies are going way down, but that's just because teens aren't going to as many parties and as many real life, shoulder to shoulder, skin to skin, social type of meetups. They're spending way more time online. So it's kind of the same thing with gaming. You're taking, I would imagine, especially with the iGen, that there's a lot of players coming up who, yes, online, they are staggeringly good CSGO players, or they're staggeringly good at Fortnite or what have you. But once you put them in the same room, shoulder to shoulder with 4 other teammates, the communication skills from the internet may not translate. I'm talking about with your wireless headsets and everything, talking to somebody 500 miles away. It's a different dynamic. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a different dynamic when you're in the same room, breathing the same air as other people, and you have a coach giving direction. That's not to say that's not completely dissimilar from the online gaming experience. Sure, you can have a team of people. You absolutely do have a team of people. You can even have a coach coaching you virtually online. A real coach. You can have somebody in Tulsa, Oklahoma, coaching a team from the other 5 various corners of the earth. 5 corners of the earth? You get what I'm saying. But it's different when you see their faces, when you breathe the same air, when you notice that one of them has body odor, when you can start smelling the smells of other people. Now you start adding into the professional esports arena cameras and crowds and all of that pressure. If you're the type of person, if you come from the iGen and you haven't spent as much time around people as maybe previous generations, and I'm not saying this as a slam on the iGen, it's just differences in upbringing and differences in reality for various generations. Basically, you're taking a fish out of water in some aspects. Whereas previous generations grew up playing team sports. So as a millennial, I grew up, yes, with video games. Of course, I've been playing video games since the 80s. Basically, since I was born, I've had video games available to me. But I also played many team sports out in the real world. I played baseball for 17 or 18 years straight. I played varsity baseball. I played basketball, JV basketball. I used to play on leagues almost every year. I probably played at least a good 10 years of basketball on a team. So my generation is maybe more, we can grasp a team sport better. And I don't necessarily mean better. We just have more experience with it. Versus you take a 17-year-old kid who got really, really good at a Fortnite, basically, but he spent 12, 16 hours a day locked away in a room online getting good at that game, and now he's at this elite level, and you're going to put him on a team with real people in a team sport type of environment. That alone can be a shock. That alone needs an adjustment. That alone is worth some psychological study. So it's all very, very fascinating. My mind just wanders. Especially with this iGen and eSports. I think there's a dynamic there that's very worth studying and very fascinating to think about and ponder. But I want to know what you think. Do you think all of this effort and all of this study by major universities, I mean, the university that's spearheading the psychological study into esports and the stressors of esports is coming out of the University of Chichester. Am I saying that right? Chichester, University of Chichester in the the UK, the United Kingdom, because they have actually offered a Bachelor's of Arts in esports. So they have an entire program around esports and training esports athletes and seeing if you have what it takes to be an esports athlete. So they're interviewing players from Counter-Strike Global Offensive or CSGO. They're interviewing players from Fortnite. They're interviewing players from various MOBAs and what have you. Different esports players to find out what it takes to be an effective esports athlete. And they are finding lots of similarities between a quarterback in the NFL and an elite Rocket League player. Not that it's the physical body damage is the same, but they're finding, for instance, things like nutrition. How much nutrition plays is a factor in an effective esports player. I know the connotation. I know the stereotype you might think of when you think of an esports gamer. Is you might think of that episode of South Park where they're playing World of Warcraft and they're just getting fat and pimply and stinky and Cartman poops himself, and you might be thinking of this out of shape, smelly person, but that's not the case. Next time you see any sort of esports tournament, whether you're at the bar or you're at home on ESPN or TBS or TNT or wherever, actually look at the teams and you will notice that the vast majority of these players are pretty darn fit. They're pretty svelte. Some of them even look like they've hit the bench press quite often. Nutrition and exercise is turning out to be incredibly important to effective esports athletes. So esports isn't just a guy sitting around in his underwear playing Super Mario Brothers. There's money to be won. There's teams to be put together. There's players to be traded. In all of these studies, all of these psychological studies and physical studies and physiological studies are going to help advance and evolve esports all the more. Thank you for listening to Geek Therapy Radio Podcast. We're going to continue where we left off with the music that's playing, the Super Smash Bros. 64 medley. I hope you join me tomorrow for more Geek Therapy Radio Podcast or the next Game Changer Radio Podcast. If you want to email me, just email me geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. I'll include it below as well. geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. And remember that you are worthy of love. You're worthy of your own self-respect. We're all geeks about something. Embrace your inner geek. And I'll see you tomorrow.
Therapy Radio, Saturday night at 10 on KPRC 950. Or listen anytime on our iHeartRadio app.